Hello, puppies and kittens. I am talking with Dan Barker. You are president of Freedom from Religion Foundation. Is that correct? As president
I'm
the right word?
co-president of
Co-president.
with
Okay,
Annie Laurie Gaylor.
gotcha. And you were you were at an event that I was asked to watch recently. Somebody sent me a video of John Lennox giving some kind of a presentation that I guess was supposed to be some sort of a public debate, full of people that I recognized, but I didn't see the whole debate. I was only shown this one little thing, and I couldn't even tell by the description where that was. You were kind enough to tell me, since you were there, that that was in Oxford in 2012. Can you tell me what that event was all about?
Yes, the Oxford University, which is a collection of universities, has a student group called the Oxford Student Union, and it's historical. They've been doing debates for, I don't know, 6,000 years or something. And in fact, that's where parliamentary debate started in there. The whole idea of the parliamentary discussion. And so the students put on debates during the year, and that year they put on a debate titled, what was the exact title of that debate? This House Believes God Exists, or something. It was about, does God exist? And usually those debates are multiple participants. So in this case, it was 3 against 3. And the 3 of us who were invited on the atheist side were myself and Michael Shermer and the philosopher Peter Millikan, who was a professor of philosophy there in Oxford. So he didn't have to travel far. And on the other side was John Lennox, the mathematician. There was also an Anglican priest named Joanna Collicutt, who had written a book critical of Richard Dawkins, so that's why she was invited. And then there was Peter Hitchens, the believing Anglican brother of Christopher Hitchens. And Peter Hitchens is still a strong believer, and those two did not get along very well. And in fact, that was the year that Christopher Hitchens had died in 2012. And so uh, also Richard Dawkins, who should have been one of the panels, he was there just to attend, and he sat behind us to cheer us on. So that was the context of that debate. And I guess you only saw Lennox's part of it. I actually don't know if the entire debate is online. We'll have to look for that. I know there are pieces of it. You can go and find my opening statement, and you can find Michael Shermer in that. But that was the context. And I have to say, of the 3 theists who were opposed to us, Lennox was the only one who said anything intelligible. He's wrong, his arguments are bad, but he was the only one who actually came to the debate prepared to debate, to actually offer arguments and evidences. The other 2 didn't. When they were talking, none of us were writing notes down. There was nothing to rebut. They were this Joanna Collicutt, a sweet woman, but she kind of got up and gave this sort of fuzzy Sunday morning sermon about, I don't know, the love of Jesus or something. It wasn't even a debate. And then Peter Hitchens, he started off by saying, we don't need to talk about evidence or argument. He didn't even want to debate. He just attacked us atheists as people. So John Lennox was the only real substance in the debate, and he brought up some arguments. He even mentioned the resurrection. And since he went before me, I was able to counter with a little bit of rebuttal about the resurrection. If you listen to his presentation, you will hear he mentioned that, among other things.
I have to wonder. I mean, I don't have the debate chops that you do. I mean, how many debates have you had?
Well, today, as of today, 141 public, formal, moderated debates before an audience. I don't count all of the media debates, or you know what I mean, those remote things. But when you talk about before an audience, where you're actually having to think on your feet while the clock is ticking, that kind of thing, 141.
That's impressive. Yeah, but in this instance, I don't think you could have been much challenged, because I had to wonder. I'd be frantically writing notes just to make sure that I covered everything, but I think I could cover everything. Well, the amount of time, because he
Yeah.
was making so many errors per minute. There's no way to correct all the errors in the few minutes that you get. But I was still impressed, and I have to be brutally honest about this. I had heard from theists for a long time without listening to the man. I had heard that, from theists, what a great thinker he was. And the only thing I knew about John Lennox was that he had publicly reconciled his faith with evolution. And so I expected that he must know something about evolution if he had come to that position. But after listening to this, I don't think he does, like, at anything at all, because he was arguing that the driving force of evolution should be the pursuit of truth, which population genetics and biodiversity and adaptability, that makes no sense at all.
Well, maybe it
Pursuit
makes
of
sense
truth?
if you have a framework that's teleological, if you assume that it's all being aimed at our species and our intelligence, then from his point of view, that kind of makes sense. And believers are going to resonate with that. So I think you're right. And you would do really well with a debate on evolution, I'm sure. You would have all your facts and arguments ready.
Well, I think what I failed to recognize is that he is looking at this from a position of that there has to be a God in order for there to be an anything. I mean, he made the implied argument that if God did not exist, then math wouldn't work.
I hear that a lot.
Yeah. It's hard for me to imagine how somebody thinks that 1 + 1 would no longer equal 2 unless God.
Yeah. And that implies that God could have made it differently, right? God
Yeah.
chose to make 1 + 1 = 2, because what if he had chosen to make it equal 3? I mean, that's kind of absurd, isn't it? To think that even God would have that power.
Yeah. In the rebuttal that I'm getting ready to publish today, I mention how I think God would be significant. It would be impossible even for God to construct a universe that could not be mathematically analyzed, and that a naturally occurring universe would, of course, have to be. So none of Lennox's arguments had any impact at all. They only showed me that the man doesn't know what he's talking about, like, ever at all. So I understand that he's published 70 articles to mathematics. Some of them in scientific journals, but it's all about math and science. So, but he's always posting about math and never anything strictly about science. I know that he's published books, popular books, not peer-reviewed, but popular books on the intersection of science and faith and theology and that sort of thing. But again, he's not actually doing scientific research, but he constantly refers to himself as a scientist. In what sense is John Lennox a scientist?
Well, he would be if you consider mathematics to be a science. And maybe that's a debatable question, but
yeah, well, I've seen the Department of Math and Science. I've never seen one that said math is science.
yeah.
And the few that I've seen polls that say among scientists, the highest percentage of those who believe in God are mathematicians. So technically, they're putting mathematicians in the category of science. But then they talk about scientists as physical scientists. So again, we have that division. So even if you put math in science, you then have to make a distinction between math and science, because science becomes physical science.
Yeah.
Why include math in science?
Especially when you consider that math is a tool that scientists use, but it's also a tool that philosophers use. It's not just pure physical science. So math is, if you consider math to be a tool, and you hear this a lot from, especially from presuppositionalists, but even from people like Frank Turek and others, who say that the laws of mathematics, or they usually say the laws of logic, had to have a lawgiver. If there's laws, there had to be a lawgiver. You hear that a lot. And so Lennox probably is thinking along that line. You know, if there's laws of math, they didn't just come out of nowhere. And a debate I did down in where was that? In Alabama, my opponent said, during the age of dinosaurs, before there were humans, did 2 + 2 = 4? And my response was, 2 + 2 = 4 is a statement. It's a proposition. And if there was a mind at that time to have formed that proposition and then to have stated it, then yes. But there were no minds at the time. So it was meaningless to even ask that question. And so my opponent said, did you hear Dan Barker said that 2 + 2 did not equal 4 during the time of the dinosaurs? How absurd is that? Which is not what I said at all. But it is a good philosophical question. What are numbers? There are even philosophers who think numbers are things. They're actual entities. And I know a lot of mathematicians who disagree with that. You know, Herb Silverman in South Carolina, he disagrees with that idea. He's into, like, what do you call it? Theoretical math or the higher math? You know, numbers are not things. And if numbers are things, every concept is a thing. A concept is a concept. So.
But then when we're talking about math, we are talking about quantities. And I think this is where we get into the real outside of the conceptual. I mean, when you have a thing and along comes another thing, there are now two things, and you don't have to have a numeral 2 or an understanding of 2. There are, in fact, two things. So, yeah. And the thing about mathematics being treated as science, or rather, a mathematician calling himself a scientist, is that the practical application is entirely different. Science does not admit of positive proof. There is a rule in science that everything is theory. That's the highest level of confidence science can achieve, because you can't prove anything to be true. Whereas they reserve that proof, positive proof, is reserved only for mathematics, which again is another distinction between mathematics and science. So science doesn't allow proof, only math does. Math, therefore, cannot be a science. Math does proof, but does not do experimentation. There's no field research. You don't have to come up with the hypotheses and falsifiability and all, not for mathematical applications, but you can prove them. And so again, when a mathematician calls himself a scientist and is representing science, and he's talking about things well out of his sphere, like Big Bang theory or abiogenesis or evolution, and all of which he's talking about, I think it's deliberately misleading to refer to yourself as a scientist in that respect.
Well, maybe so, but I was invited to that debate, and I'm not a professional scientist or a professional philosopher, and yet I was invited to comment, to participate in that debate. I didn't claim to be a professional scientist, which is what I think you're saying, but yeah. You don't have to be a professional anything to have some knowledge, to be conversant with the field.
Well, that's not what I mean to imply. It's just It is misleading when you represent yourself as a scientist if in fact you don't do science.
Well, okay. Mm-hmm. So talking about 2 + 2 = 4. Suppose there's this table that's empty, and I put 2 apples on the table, and then you come along and you put 2 more apples on the table. How many apples are there?
As you said, there are quantities, and quantities are real. Whether there is somebody there to count them and understand how to count doesn't matter. There's the fact is there are 4.
Well, that's actually not true. My question was, how many apples are there
on the table?
Exactly. So in order to make a mathematical framing, you have to frame it. During the time of the dinosaurs, who was doing any framing? If there's 2 dinosaurs on this field and 2 more dinosaurs come into this field, there's not 4 dinosaurs, there's millions of dinosaurs. Somebody has to mentally rope off that field or that tabletop so that we can say, if I had asked you how many apples are on the table, then of course 4. But my question to you was, how many apples are there? you assumed the framing, and it's only a brain that can do that, right? So how many apples are there? Billions, right? We don't know. So that whole process of doing math assumes a framing that doesn't exist actually in reality. I mean, you could say that field that the dinosaurs are in is a frame, but somebody has got to do that. Some brain has to actually limit the area and count the items that are in the area to objectively verify that 2 + 2 = 4.
That brings up an important point that seemingly always comes up in this discussion, and that's the notion of truth. Truth being where the theist will claim things to be true that no one can show to be true. There's no evidence of it. There's no way to prove it false. They just say that it's true, and we're supposed to, I guess, prove it. They're allowed to prove it. They're allowed to say that it's true, and then we have to prove that it's false, or accept that if we can't prove that what they said is false, then we have to accept it as true somehow.
Yeah.
And we can't. What the reality is, you can't say that something is true unless you know that it is. And that's where I have my biggest problem with theology in general, is that every religion makes these assertions, baseless speculation that they assert as if it was fact. I always have a problem with that. If you don't know it, if you can't show it, you don't know if you know it. So what are you doing telling people that this is the fact? If you make up statistics off the top of your head where you've no studies to back it up, you just guess that 68.7% of whatever is whatever, and you say it that way as if it's a fact, that is tantamount to lying.
Well, okay. And I tend to be charitable towards those people. What they say may be untrue. I don't know if it's a lie and not a deliberate lie, but a lot of philosophers, a lot of theistic philosophers, and some apologists are careful to say that God is the best explanation. They're not saying necessarily that it is 100% true, but they're saying, especially when it comes to like fine tuning, and that comes a lot in debates. And I have a whole chapter on fine tuning. I'll tell you about this next book that's coming out. If you look at all of the possible explanations for some question that we have, put them in a line. What is the best one? It'd be like if you're investigating a crime and the investigators are trying to come up with suspects or a prime suspect. They might be able to do that. They might say, okay, we've got our best shot here. And that doesn't go very far, but in the minds of a lot of theists, that goes far enough to say we are justified. Since God, since a supreme being appears to be the best explanation for fine tuning, we are therefore justified in putting that forth as our answer. They're not necessarily saying it's 100% true. Some of them are very sophisticated and very honest and very good about it. They're just saying, they use the word abduction, the abductive logic that comes up with the best explanation that fits the facts, according to what we know now, obviously. And of course, you and I would come back and say, well, we don't know everything yet. In the future, there may be a different best explanation. I don't think God is their best explanation, and I argue against that. But at least they're not lying. They're not like deliberately trying to deceive us with some phony lie. So
I'm going to take the counter position that the people I'm arguing with, the creationists, they definitely are willfully, knowingly lying. And when they say things like every knee will bow and you will face Jesus when you die, they're not saying that this is probably the best explanation. No, they're making baseless assertions as if it's a fact.
Yeah,
and my favorite quote from Abraham Lincoln is that it is an established maxim in morals that he who makes an assertion without knowing whether it is true or false is guilty of falsehood, and the accidental truth of the assertion does not justify or excuse him. And that's where I stand.
Yeah. And that's why scientists say that we are accepting a fact with a high degree of probability. It's 98 or 99%. It may not be 100, but we're going to round it off for now. And so most scientists are honest about that. We have enough data, enough experience. Quantum mechanics is 99.99999, but it's not 100. But it's so close. It is so close that because it works, right? We go with it because it works. But I'm sure you've debated a bunch of people on the other extreme of the bell curve that you might call nutty, right? And I've debated some of them, but to be fair, there are some over here who are not nutty. They're actually educated. They know their philosophy. They know their history. They're making their arguments. They're wrong, but at least they're giving it a good, honest shot. So
when they start arguing creationism, then they might end up going against me.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and I know a lot of those books and a lot of those debates, and I've debated some people that are just totally, Jesus could have risen from the dead, one guy said. I was at Tufts University, and my opponent said, from what we know about probabilities and quantum mechanics and the uncertainty principle and on and on, it's not unlikely that the atoms and molecules in the body of Jesus could have passed through the stone, through the rock to have emerged. That's not impossible. And he should have heard that audience go, huh? He's trying to give a plausible scientific explanation for how a miracle might have happened, right? In which case it's not a miracle. In which case
my mother told me when I was a little boy that Jesus could walk through walls. Where she got this information, I don't know. The Bible doesn't talk about that.
Yeah,
but she says that Jesus could walk through walls. Okay, how? As she tells me that Jesus could make his molecules separate and then go between the molecules of the wall. So again, we've got this is not a hypothetical. She's just stating it as a fact. Got nothing to go on. But that's what she says.
It's from the book of Acts when the disciples were in the upper room and the door was closed and then Jesus appeared to them. The only way that could have happened is if he went through the wall. And so there are some Christians think that. Not all of them do, of course. Okay. He might have zapped into the room like Star Trek. He might have just, but some believers think that. So that's the conclusion they come to.
So for those who have seen maybe my first video in the series but haven't seen that whole debate and who don't want to sit through Peter Hitchens and the woman giving the sermons, and who don't want to sit through maybe, I don't know, an hour or so of everybody's different presentation looking for the good bits, can you summarize your participation and also that of your two partners in that debate?
Yeah. That was how many years ago? That was 13 years ago, right?
Yeah.
And I did a second debate at Oxford 2 years ago with a different panel. This was Phil Zuckerman the second time. But basically, I summarized my argument with claiming, and I know some atheists disagree, but I claim atheism is the absence of belief in God, and based on a number of absences. The absence of a coherent definition of a God. I mean, that's a starting point, right? If you can't even define, and if believers can't even define that God, well, then what are we debating? And so there is really an absence of a coherent definition of a God. Each believer thinks they have one. But second, the absence of evidence for a God. Then there's the absence of good argument for a God. And there's maybe 8 or 10 basic arguments that they propose, a priori arguments that, first cause and then design, teleology, fine-tuning, the moral argument, and so on. Then there's the absence of agreement among believers about the nature of this God and his moral principles. Then there's an absence of a good answer to the problem of evil, or as more people are calling it this day, the problem of suffering. And I have a chapter in John Loftus's book about God and horrendous suffering that addresses that. And then finally, there's an absence of a need to believe in God. Millions, tens of millions of people in the United States, hundreds of millions of people on the planet live happy, moral, productive, meaningful, loving lives without believing in a God. So there's no need for it. So when you put all of these absences together, it makes a cumulative case that it's very unlikely that a God exists, but I'm open to being convinced otherwise.
We imagine a Star Trek world with what you're describing, where people don't believe in God anymore. It's funny that there was one episode of Star Trek where um, Bill Shatner changed the script. Roddenberry was an atheist, and has Captain Kirk meeting Apollo, the Greek god, and Kirk is supposed to say something like, "We've gone beyond the need for gods," and the line was changed to, "We've gone beyond the need for multiple gods. We find the one sufficient." And while that was deeply disappointing, it was eventually disappointing even for Shatner, who became an atheist late in life and regretted having changed that line.
Yeah, well, it's ingrained in you, the way you think. I mean, when I was a preacher, I was a believer for years. Those 19 years that I was preaching, it was just so obviously true to me that Christianity was just, I mean, I thought something was wrong with people who doubted what was so obviously true. And isn't it funny how our brains do that? We latch on to whatever religion you're in. Most Muslims think that. It's obvious that Allah, and it's obvious that Muhammad was his prophet.
That's a fascinating thing for me, because that's not what I was asking you about at all, and I want to get back to that. But I am interested in that perspective, because I was a believer once upon a time myself, not so much in Christianity. I was a believer in Christianity for like a minute, but I was actually more convinced of neo-pagan spiritualism after that, which again, of course, turned out to be complete poppycock too. But I thought it was demonstrable. I thought I could show people what the occult was like and that it was real. And I'm embarrassed that I ever thought that.
Yeah. Well, I feel the same way about many of my Christian beliefs, which is not to say that all Christians are stupid or that they're all bad people. In fact, I think most Christians are good people. Maybe not the extreme creationists that you debate, but I think most Christians are good people. I think they're good in spite of their faith. They're better than God. They're better than the Bible, and their religion is meaningful to them in many ways.
I've often argued that believers in the Bible are more moral than their Bible, and I sometimes put the challenge to them.
Yeah,
to
demonstrate. You're right.
But if we can, while that is a fascinating topic, and I would like to hear more at another time about how it is to be convinced of the obviousness of this belief that you no longer hold, as I held that same position myself, I still want to hear your and your partner's rebuttals to, I guess, was Lennox own and not the other two that were working with him. How did that?
Oh yeah, rebuttals.
Yeah.
Well, in my book, Life-Driven Purpose, I reprint a lot of some of what Peter Hitchens said, because he came after me and I didn't have a chance to say anything. So in my book, Life-Driven Purpose, I do reply to Peter Hitchens. And with Lennox, fine-tuning and design and the resurrection. That's what I remember. That debate was so long ago. I don't know if I remember everything Lennox said. But to summarize design and fine tuning, for example, there's a line in the book by Vic Stenger. He wrote a book called The Fallacy of Fine Tuning. And there's a great line in that book where he says, the universe was not fine tuned for us. We were fine tuned for the universe. They've got it backwards. They've got it totally 180 degrees backwards. And in my book, Contradiction, I
which
use
I just received.
Oh, you got a copy of it? Good.
I've got it. Yep.
In there, I use the example of, have you ever been sitting in a train that's not moving, when the train next to you starts to move and you briefly think it's you who's moving? I think that's happened to all of us in a car or a plane or something. Your brain 180-degree flipped reality around. From your point of view, you got it totally backwards. Or it's like the guy who's so impressed. How did they make all those rivers flow right along the state border? How did they do that? That must have been a huge, massive, expensive civic project to fine tune those rivers to fit the borders so perfectly. Of course, we realize that's backward. The rivers came first, right? So when it comes to design arguments and fine tuning, a lot of believers are that same reversal trick is happening in their brains. They're seeing it one way around when reality is the other way around. The universe wasn't fine tuned and tinkered, and these values weren't adjusted so that we could exist. We, because of the process of natural selection through evolution, we have evolved to finely tune fit the universe that we're in. It's a totally reversal of thinking. So most design arguments are phony because of that. They're assuming they're assuming a teleology in the first place, and then they're seeing it in the wrong direction.
And I would say that a lot of theological arguments that I've heard do just sound like reversed thinking. Putting the cart before the horse, as it were. Do you remember any of Milliken's or Shermer's responses, how they addressed this?
They both gave good opening statements, and Shermer was real good on science, and Milliken was real good on just some philosophical objections to theism. But I'd have to go back and re-listen to those because that was some time ago. And I'll tell you something that happened in both of those Oxford debates, especially in this last one. The three of us on our side, we collaborated, we talked, we decided you cover this, you can cover that, and I'll cover this. How about this? So that there was no overlap, right? And we came prepared, and then we even told the student organizers we would like so-and-so to go first. But in both of the cases in both of those debates, the other side did not collaborate. They probably didn't even talk with each other. They each got up and gave sort of independent little speeches, right, without any coherence. And in 2023, the debate I did with Phil Zuckerman and Alex O'Connor, if you know Alex O'Connor, he's British. We talked it through, and so Phil went first and gave his strong arguments about. I mean, he was really a sociological argument is what he gave. If you look at the world and you look at belief, and then Alex gave a really strong philosophical argument objecting to theism. And my job was to mop up. My job was to be a rebuttal, because in many of these debates, there's no real time for rebuttal or cross-examination. Like in most debates, it's one against one, and you have an opening statement, then you have rebuttals and cross-examinations, and maybe a second rebuttal and closings. But in these Oxford and also in the Cambridge debate that Annie Laurie did last year, it was the same way. It was almost like just side-by-side lectures. And then the audience, students were supposed to just sort of pick from that. So in this case, in 2023, I deliberately only prepared like 1 or 2 minutes, and I left the open for rebuttal on the fly to what the opponents may have said during the debate. And during that debate, it was the same thing. There was a Sikh, from India, the Sikh religion, who's a member of parliament, actually. He's in the House of Lords. He gave a talk about the beauty of Sikhism. And then a Roman Catholic cardinal from Ghana was another opponent. He didn't say anything about anything except the beauty of Catholicism, basically. There was no real meat there. And
does the one presentation on the beauty of Catholicism negate or challenge the beauty of Sikhism?
Well, they didn't go.
They're not both praising what they have in common.
No, but they didn't go at each other. It wasn't that kind of a debate. It would have been better if they had gone at each other. That's what we expect from a debate. So the only real argument that was raised, this was at an Oxford debate, right? Besides the 6 of us, 3 and 3, before the debate started, 2 students from the Oxford Student Union, they gave some brief opening remarks. An atheist named Chloe Davis, and then what was his name? A really brilliant young student from Scotland, David. He gave a very well presented, articulate argument from fine-tuning. He used fine-tuning as his key. And I have to say, and most atheist debaters I know will say, Christopher Hitchens said this, that out of all the arguments that the theists have, their best one is fine-tuning. It's not good. Hitchens said it's not a good argument. It doesn't prove anything, but it's not trivial. You have to deal with it. You have to think about it. You have to come to terms with that. So David, what was his last name? David. Anyway, the student gave a really good, really nice guy argument from fine-tuning. So during my final presentation, I was able then to devote time to rebutting fine-tuning, and I did it similar to how you just heard me say about the reversal, the reversal of our thinking when it comes to teleology and all of that.
Okay. Now, I remember working with Millikan once, or not working with, but he helped me with something. And I was happy for the philosophical clarification. I wish I had more time to study philosophy more formally. It's one of the things that most people criticize me for, and the thing that they don't understand when I criticize philosophy is I'm not actually criticizing philosophy. I'm criticizing how it is misused by the fundamentalists that I argue with. All right, so I don't know how much further that I can take this. I want to thank you for clarifying what was going on in that. Hopefully, somebody will be able to find that whole video, and if they can find it all in one piece or in pieces, I could put the links in the description for this one. I'd be happy to do that. And I don't see myself ever going to Oxford for such a thing as this, but I mean, gosh, that would be nice.
It's fun, but you got to wear a tuxedo.
I was just about to mention that. I noted that everybody there.
And then they have this banquet ahead of time. It's very British. They have this banquet. Everybody's dressed up really. And I was able to bring a guest. So I asked Richard Dawkins to come, and Richard Dawkins and his new girlfriend, they came to the banquet too.
Dawkins was not invited to that?
No, and in fact, he should have been, because the topic was "This house believes God is a delusion." And yet he wasn't invited. Maybe he was, and he turned it down. But he wanted to come to the debate. He sat with us. But then they do like a toast to the royalty, and there's all this very British stuff that you have to do. And the students are all dressed up very formal, and you have to, Phil Zuckerman went to Oxford, and he just rented a tuxedo for the day because he didn't have one of his own. But since I play jazz piano, I have a tuxedo that I use all the time. So that was fun. Before we go, I want to mention one more thing, and after you're finished.
Go ahead.
Oh, okay. So I did a debate 2 or 3 years ago in Florida with Dr. Andrew Lloyd Johnson, and these issues came up: fine-tuning, the first cause, especially the Kalam cosmological, and the moral argument. But other issues came up as well, like the immaterial minds and free will and consciousness and all that. Erdman's publisher, that's EERD, Erdman's publisher is a well-known big Christian publisher. They are publishing a book about that debate, and they have transcribed both of our statements and our rebuttals and the whole thing, even questions from the audience. You can read the debate. Then they have enlisted 6 theistic philosophers and 6 atheistic philosophers to comment on our debate. And Alex Malpass, for example, and Daniel Linford, for example, and others. And then they've enlisted others to write forwards and afterwards and all that. So it's a pretty substantial book. And then Adam and I, my opponent and I, we both have 2 additional chapters, additional thoughts and closing remarks. So it's a pretty substantive book that covers a lot. The only thing it doesn't cover is the problem of evil, because we didn't have time to get into that, and nobody brought it up. So, but there's some good stuff in there on the Kalam cosmological argument, and on fine-tuning, and on moral argument. And since Adam brought up the Bible in a couple of cases, I was able to actually get into some Bible criticism too. So the title of that book, it's coming out this year. It's called "Has God Been Found?" And the hiddenness argument came up as well. You know, if there's a God, why are we debating it? If there's a God, why does he need arguments? Why does he seem like he's hiding, right? And so, in fact, the hiddenness argument by Schellenberg is a pretty powerful argument, and he allowed me to reproduce his basic 7-point argument in there. So you can read that book when it comes out, and we have been invited to in November, the American Academy of Religion / Society of Biblical Literature have their annual conference. So Adam and I and others are going to be presenting at that conference in Boston. I don't know when the book is going to be released. Maybe it'll be released right about that time, but it's in process now being published. So, and I guarantee that even those published by a Christian publisher, atheists are going to love reading the book because it's giving both sides from what they think is a fair and balanced position. So,
well, hopefully, but you haven't read the book yet.
Well, I've read all of the other contributors.
Yeah,
I've read everything else that's in it. The only thing I haven't read is
how they've edited it together.
Well, yeah, I assume they're going to be honest about that. Yeah, we'll see.
That's what I'm sure that Dawkins thought that Ben Stein was going to be honest about his interview too.
Well, okay, maybe I'll change my mind, but it seems like they're very good people, and they want, and people like Adam Johnson, they really are thoughtful Christians. They are trying to deal, and Adam even admitted during our debate, he says there are many thoughtful, intelligent philosophers who are atheists, and he said he respects them. He disagrees with them, but they're engaged at a certain level of civil dialogue with each other where they don't mind disagreeing, and they love getting into it. So in the philosophy of religion, you will find people like that who are, I think they're sincere, they're honest, and they're giving their best shot at the argument. And this book might go some way towards helping us decide who has the better arguments in these debates.
Yeah. One last comment on Lennox. I had only heard, that theists respect him as an educated thinker. I mean, there's certainly credibility in having published 70 articles on mathematics, whatever, relevance that has. At least he's published. And I only knew that he had reconciled his faith with evolution. So whenever creationists would bring up him, I would mention that fact, and they would drop him from their sources. But when I actually heard his arguments, they were embarrassingly bad. I mean, not just bad, they were beginner level. And for somebody who spent so many decades arguing the subject, presumably every day, I would have thought that he would have had better than first level arguments. Yeah, so that's all I heard.
Well, I think you're right about that, but to be fair, you only have like 10 minutes. You can't fully develop and give all the backgrounds or everything. But of course, you're right. His arguments are wrong. But I will say there's more to a debate than just the words. Like when Christopher Hitchens would debate, he had an additional 20% plus because of his accent. You know what I mean? The way that British accent of his.
It's not just the authority of his accent; it was the strength of his voice.
Well, yeah, but
the magnificent narrator.
well, and the strength of his arguments too. But you know what I mean? In a public debate, that goes a long way. And John Lennox does have that certain charisma. He looks like your favorite uncle that you would just, you know what I mean? He has that Irish accent.
Yeah.
He has a twinkle in his eye. He's got all of that, which it's the intangible part of a debate that goes a long way toward convincing people. Some people are convinced just by the sincerity of the person, whether their arguments are good or not. You're not convinced by that. But
the first time I saw Hitchens debate, it was in a Prestonwood Baptist Church that has a 7,500 seat stadium sanctuary.
Yeah, I was there once.
Yeah, and that was just alarming. That they once had Ray Comfort in there give a 30-minute sermon, and they paid him $1,000 per minute to repeat the same argument that he always repeats. Have you ever told a lie? You know, that same thing is just completely unfair. But then they had this debate, and they brought in people from all the Christian schools in the area. It completely filled up the building. But the funny thing to me was that you've got Christopher Hitchens, who is, nobody's going to argue, he was our best. That's, if we all of us would choose who's going to represent us, it would be that guy. No, hands down, he's our best. And the champion that you're going to put up against him is Bill Dembski? You sure?
I was in that room once. I debated Dinesh D'Souza there at Prestonwood. And Dinesh has that certain extra showmanship quality that audiences love. He and I had 8 debates together. 8 debates in as many different states. We debated, and then I finally cut it off. And if you want to know why, I wrote a blog about why I will no longer debate Dinesh D'Souza, which is that
I think I read that. Yeah,
it's on the Free Thought Now blog. Look it up, and you'll see my contributions in there.
All right. Well, Mr. Barker, I would like to take the last minute of this interview and promote whatever you've got going on or whatever is most relevant. Sell yourself for a moment, and then we'll close it up.
Well, you know, I'm co-president of Freedom from Religion Foundation. We're almost 43,000 members now, going strong. We're going to have our next convention in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina in October, and it's filling up fast. It'll be a lot of fun. One of our speakers is Mary Trump, who's the niece of Donald Trump, who's an outspoken atheist. She'll be there to tell us about her dysfunctional family. And many others. So go to ffrf.org and either join the foundation or sign up for the convention.
Outstanding. Thank you for your time, sir.
Thank you. It's always fun, Aaron.